Right now, as you're watching this, there's a force pushing against the walls of every single artery in your body. Not stress, not tension, an actual physical pressure running through your brain, your kidneys, and the vessels feeding your heart. And it's happening whether you feel it or not. That's what blood pressure really is. Not just a number your doctor writes down and tucks into a file. It's a constant mechanical force that, over months and years, quietly reshapes how your arteries behave, how hard your heart has to work, and whether your most vital organs are still doing their job when you reach your 70s and 80s. Here's the part that most people never hear. High blood pressure doesn't warn you, it doesn't cause pain, it doesn't make you tired, it doesn't slow you down, it just keeps building silently until one day it shows up as a stroke, a heart attack, kidney failure, or memory loss. That's how it announces itself, and by then the damage has already been done. For 50 years we've been told that salt is the enemy. Cut your sodium, lower your pressure. Simple. Except for most people, it hasn't worked. And now we're beginning to understand why. Because there's another driver that's been hiding in plain sight the whole time, one that pushes blood pressure up through a completely different route, one that has nothing to do with water retention and everything to do with hormones. And that driver is sugar. If that surprises you, drop a comment below and let me know. Because what I'm about to explain changes everything about the way most people think about blood pressure. To understand why this matters so much, you first need to know what actually creates blood pressure in your body. And it comes down to three forces. Just three. The first is cardiac output, which is how much blood your heart pumps out with each beat. The second is blood volume, which is the total amount of fluid circulating through your system at any given moment. The third is vascular resistance, which is how open or constricted your arteries are right now. If any one of those three goes up, your blood pressure rises. If all three go up at the same time, your pressure can climb to dangerous levels very quickly. Now here's where it gets important. Your body controls each one of those forces differently. Cardiac output responds to adrenaline and your nervous system. Blood volume is regulated by your kidneys, which decide every minute of every day how much sodium and water to hold on to and how much to release. Vascular resistance is controlled by a thin layer of cells lining the inside of your arteries called the endothelium, which produces a compound called nitric oxide to keep those arteries open, relaxed, and flexible. When nitric oxide production drops, your arteries stiffen up, resistance climbs, and your blood pressure rises, even if your heart rate and blood volume haven't changed at all. When you see the system this way, something becomes very clear. Blood pressure isn't just one problem. It's the result of kidney signaling, arterial flexibility, nervous system tone, and hormonal balance all working together, or in many cases working against each other. That's exactly why telling someone to just eat less salt works for some people and does almost nothing for others. The question isn't simply what you're eating. It's which part of your pressure system is breaking down, and why. Now let's talk about salt because it does play a role and it's worth understanding how. Sodium is what scientists call osmotically active. What that means in plain English is that wherever sodium goes, water follows. When you eat a salty meal, sodium gets absorbed into your bloodstream. Your body wants to keep the concentration of sodium in your blood very tightly controlled, so it pulls water in from surrounding tissues to dilute it. That temporarily increases the volume of fluid circulating in your system. More fluid in a closed circulatory system means higher pressure. It's simple fluid mechanics. Your kidneys respond by working harder to excrete the extra sodium and water, and eventually your pressure comes back down. In a healthy body, this feedback loop works beautifully. You eat more salt one day, your kidneys clear it out, and your pressure stabilizes without any lasting change. The problem is that salt sensitivity varies enormously from person to person. Some people, particularly those with reduced kidney function or certain genetic variations, see dramatic pressure spikes from sodium. Others can eat relatively high amounts of salt and show almost no pressure response at all, because their kidneys and vessels are still flexible enough to handle the adjustment. What decades of research have shown us is that salt primarily raises pressure through water retention and fluid volume. It's a volume problem. It's not a disease driver by itself, and that distinction is critically important because it means reducing salt might address one piece of the puzzle while leaving the bigger problem completely untouched, and that bigger problem is sugar. When you eat refined carbohydrates or sugar, your blood glucose rises and your pancreas releases insulin to move that glucose into your cells. Most people know that part of the story. What almost nobody knows is what insulin does next. Insulin doesn't just lower your blood sugar, it also signals your kidneys to hold on to sodium. Not because you've eaten salt, simply because insulin itself is a sodium-retaining hormone. The more insulin circulating in your bloodstream, the more sodium your kidneys absorb, and the more water gets pulled into your system as a result. This creates a pressure rise that has nothing to do with how much salt you've eaten. You could be following a strict low-sodium diet, but if your insulin is chronically elevated because you're eating processed carbs throughout the day, your kidneys are being told hormonally to keep holding on to sodium around the clock. That's the first pathway. Then there's a second one. Chronic high insulin activates your sympathetic nervous system, which is your body's fight-or-flight system. This raises your heart rate, boosts your cardiac output, and constricts peripheral blood vessels. You're getting more output and more resistance at the same time, which drives pressure up from two directions simultaneously. Then there's a third pathway, and this one involves fructose, the type of sugar found in corn syrup, sweetened beverages, and most processed foods. Fructose is metabolized almost entirely in the liver. When it breaks down, it produces uric acid as a byproduct. And elevated uric acid, shown repeatedly in research studies, impairs endothelial function. It reduces nitric oxide availability and prevents your arteries from relaxing properly. It also directly increases the amount of sodium your kidneys reabsorb, independent of insulin entirely. So fructose isn't just raising your blood sugar and insulin levels, it's chemically altering how your kidneys handle sodium and how your blood vessels respond to pressure. Sugar is working through kidney signaling and arterial stiffness at the same time, and it does all of this whether or not you've touched the salt shaker. Now here's where the real trap is. In a metabolically healthy person, insulin rises after a meal, signals the kidneys to retain a little sodium temporarily, and then falls back to baseline once the glucose is cleared. The kidneys then release that sodium, pressure normalizes, and the system resets itself. It's a beautifully designed feedback loop. But in someone with insulin resistance, which now describes the majority of adults over 50 in this country, insulin doesn't fall back to baseline. It stays elevated throughout the day because the cells have stopped responding to it properly. The pancreas has to keep pumping out more and more just to maintain normal blood sugar. When insulin is chronically high, the kidneys never receive the signal to release sodium. They're locked into retention mode, day after day after day. This is exactly why so many people reduce their salt intake and see almost no change in their blood pressure. They're addressing the volume side of the equation while the hormonal control system is still instructing the kidneys to hold on to sodium regardless of how little salt they're eating. The kidneys aren't just passive filters, they're pressure valves controlled by hormones. And if the hormones are sending the wrong signal, the valve stays closed no matter what. It gets worse. Insulin resistance also damages the endothelium directly. Chronically high insulin reduces nitric oxide production over time. Your arteries gradually lose their ability to relax, so now you have blood volume being artificially expanded through sodium retention and vascular resistance climbing because the arteries have stiffened. Both arms of the blood pressure equation are being driven upward at the same time. And reducing salt alone doesn't fix either one of them. This is what researchers now call the metabolic pressure trap. And this is why 50 years of public health advice focused almost entirely on sodium reduction has failed to solve the hypertension crisis in this country. Now look at what actually dominates the modern American diet. The foods most people eat every day don't contain just salt or just sugar. They contain both, engineered together in specific combinations designed to keep you eating more. A typical breakfast cereal, a frozen meal, fast food, a packaged snack, they all deliver high sodium and high refined carbohydrates at the same time. That combination is not accidental. It's deliberate food design, and the effect on blood pressure is far worse than either ingredient would cause on its own. When you eat processed food, you're getting sodium that immediately expands your plasma volume through water retention, and at the same time you're getting refined carbohydrates that spike insulin and lock your kidneys into that sodium retention mode. The result is that your blood pressure goes up from the volume load, and then it stays up because the hormonal signal to release that sodium never arrives. You're hitting both pathways at once. The sodium creates the initial pressure rise. The sugar prevents your body from ever correcting it. And to make it even worse, most processed foods are also extremely low in potassium, which is sodium's natural counterbalance in the body. Potassium helps your kidneys excrete sodium and supports your arteries in staying relaxed. Whole foods like vegetables, beans, and unprocessed meats are naturally rich in potassium and relatively low in sodium. Processed foods flip that ratio completely upside down. You end up with high sodium, low potassium, high refined carbohydrates, and high fructose all at once. It's a perfect storm for chronic high blood pressure. And it explains why hypertension is overwhelmingly a disease connected to modern industrial food, not a problem caused by people salting their home-cooked meals. Now here is the part that actually gives you something to work with. When you understand what drives blood pressure up, you automatically understand what brings it down. It's two sides of the same coin. Biologically, blood pressure falls when three things happen. First, insulin drops and stays low for extended periods. When that happens, the kidneys are finally free to release sodium the way they're supposed to. Second, nitric oxide production in the endothelium increases, which relaxes the arteries and reduces vascular resistance. Third, the kidneys start responding to actual sodium intake again, rather than being locked into retention mode by hormones. Those are the three levers. And here is the key point that ties everything together. Everything that genuinely lowers blood pressure over the long term works through one or more of those three mechanisms. Everything. Physical activity, for example, is one of the most powerful blood pressure interventions we have. And the reason might surprise you. When you do aerobic movement, even a brisk walk, you create what's called shear stress on the walls of your blood vessels. That stimulates your endothelium to produce more nitric oxide. And critically, that effect doesn't stop when you sit back down. It lasts for hours after the activity ends. That's exactly why regular movement creates sustained pressure reduction that builds over time. It's not about burning calories. It's about turning your endothelium into a more active producer of the compound that keeps your arteries open and relaxed. Dietary fiber works through a completely different pathway. Fiber slows glucose absorption, which flattens the blood sugar spikes you get after meals. That in turn reduces the amount of insulin your pancreas needs to produce throughout the day. And lower insulin means your kidneys aren't being constantly signaled to hold on to sodium, which allows the natural pressure regulation your body was designed to perform. Sleep affects your blood pressure through yet another mechanism. Poor sleep increases what's called sympathetic tone, which raises your heart rate and constricts your blood vessels. Deep restorative sleep allows the parasympathetic nervous system to take over, which lowers both cardiac output and vascular resistance at the same time. It's like switching from the gas pedal to the brake. None of these interventions require perfection. They don't require expensive supplements or radical changes overnight. What they require is understanding what your body actually needs in order to regulate its own pressure, and then consistently moving in that direction. Now here's something important that comes from the clinical side of this. Medication for blood pressure absolutely works. ACE inhibitors reduce hormonal signaling that constricts blood vessels. Diuretics help the kidneys excrete sodium more efficiently. Calcium channel blockers relax arterial smooth muscle directly. These medications save lives and they work through real biological mechanisms. But what becomes clear when you look at patients over time is that medication controls blood pressure. It doesn't reverse what caused it. The most striking outcomes come from patients who are doing both things at once, taking medication if they need it, while also addressing the underlying metabolic environment that drove the pressure up in the first place. When insulin is improving, when the endothelium is recovering, when the kidneys are handling sodium more appropriately, the medication works better. Some patients are able to reduce their doses. Some are able to work with their doctors to come off certain medications entirely, not because they found a shortcut, but because they fixed what was broken underneath. There's also a very clear pattern in who responds to salt restriction and who doesn't. Younger, leaner individuals with high blood pressure often see meaningful improvements when they reduce sodium intake because their kidneys and vessels are still flexible enough to adjust. Older adults with insulin resistance, excess abdominal weight, or metabolic syndrome rarely see significant improvement from salt restriction alone because their pressure is being driven hormonally, not just mechanically. That doesn't mean salt doesn't matter for them. It means salt isn't the primary driver, and treating it as if it is leads to frustration and eventually giving up. The patients who genuinely reverse their hypertension are the ones who address the metabolic foundation, not the ones who obsess over the salt shaker. So where does all of this leave us? Salt raises blood pressure temporarily by expanding blood volume, that's fluid mechanics. Sugar raises blood pressure chronically by elevating insulin, activating the nervous system, impairing arterial function, and preventing the kidneys from releasing sodium properly. That's hormonal control. And in the modern American diet, they almost always appear together, not as separate ingredients you might encounter on different days, but combined in the same meal, the same snack, the same processed food, engineered to hit both pathways at once. The reason decades of salt-focused public health advice hasn't solved the hypertension crisis is that we've been treating the volume side of the equation while completely ignoring the hormonal side. You cannot fix a hormonally locked system just by reducing sodium intake. The kidneys wouldn't release it anyway. The signal isn't coming. What actually lowers blood pressure for good is restoring the hormonal environment that allows your kidneys to regulate sodium properly, your arteries to relax normally, and your cardiac output to settle. That happens when insulin comes down, when nitric oxide rises, and when the processed food that hijacks both systems is replaced with real, whole food that your body actually knows how to work with. Hypertension is not fundamentally a salt problem. It is not fundamentally a sugar problem. It is a processed food problem that breaks blood pressure regulation at multiple points in the system simultaneously. And the good news is that the system can recover. It was built to regulate itself. Sometimes it just needs the right conditions to do it. If this gave you a new way of thinking about blood pressure, share this video with someone you care about who might need to hear it. And if you've been told for years that salt is the only thing to watch, leave a comment below and let me know whether this changes how you're thinking about it. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today.